So first of all, I'd like to just thank Dale for opening up the conversation around minimal computing, and I'm going to be building on that a little bit, and it's great that we were able to see kind of an implementation of WAX. So what my favorite types of presentations are doing is just showing some cool projects, and that's what this is really based around. So you can see a link to my slides, and I'd encourage you to follow along. So where I'm interested in this is also just from a different angle of Dale. So I'm not a technologist necessarily in the coding way. And at the time that I was first introduced to minimal computing was at a conference presentation in 2018. And at the time I was looking at a bunch of old digital collections and trying to basically figure out what to do with them. And so this kind of sparked some ideas in me. At the exact same time, on a more personal note, I was really starting to want to do something, right? So I was in this kind of project management role. I was doing a lot of middle management, and I missed doing something. I didn't know how to code. The last time I coded was in 2007 in my web design class in library school. And so this idea of Markdown, this idea of static sites actually kind of resonated with me. So I'm going to skip the definition because we already kind of went through what minimal computing looks like. I would encourage you to go to the website. There's some really interesting kind of articles that digs in a little bit more. But I did want to look a little bit more at this last slide here. Gentry Sayers wrote a really good article that really digs into kind of the definitions of what they mean by digital minimal computing and how it kind of goes in. But they also really talk about the use, consumption, and obsolescence, and so minimizing that. So along the lines of climate change, thinking about less, and also a hardware perspective, and also a code perspective, and how that kind of gets interpreted within minimal computing. The next thing I wanted to introduce was actually a really good way to kind of conceptualize what minimal computing means, and this is the methodology that was developed by Evan Williamson. He's a digital librarian at the University of Idaho, and it's a project called libstatic, and I'm going to talk about a collection builder in a little bit, and that's kind of from this idea of the methodology. But here he's really talking about minimal computing, meaning that it's open, and so both open data, but also just really open and obvious. He also talks about simple systems, so lower barriers of access. We've talked a little bit about that tension of IT, right? So accessible infrastructure, library optimized, so a lot of talk around not being dependent on library infrastructure as well, but also third parties, so different systems like maybe Content DM, so that's where some of these projects came out of. And then also user focus. So again, we're talking about minimal design, less material on the screen, kind of easier to see what it is, and reusable and shareable data as well. In some of the projects focused on here, they talk about collections as data, which is another kind of movement that's happening right now that people are talking about. But the interesting stuff is really about the projects. And so I wanted to show you guys some of the stuff that I've found that's using these principles in a library context to just kind of spark some ideas. So my first kind of maybe favorite one right now is a proof of concept site that Ed Summer wrote about in a blog post in 2018. And so he developed this for the Lakehead Community Heritage Project. And the goal here was to make a more sustainable and portable version of the site. And so at the time, they'd actually originally built this site with the University of Maryland on an Omeka instance. But the university was going to start kind of closing down this site, and so they were really thinking about ways to meaningfully transfer the data back to the community in a usable fashion. So they made this static offline website that could be transported on a thumb drive. So there was a literal transfer of the data, and so that people could do that. And they kind of looked at it. Another thing he talks about in his blog post that I'd really recommend that you kind of engage with a little bit is he talked about the idea of generous interfaces. And so here again, this is a community-based project. And so they were really focused on these ideas of browsable, serendipitous, and kind of enjoyable information spaces. And so you can click on the little video of the Vimeo demo to kind of see it interact. And it's just a long scrolling page with kind of this, images that show up and that you can engage with. I really love it. The next one I encountered is migrating older projects that are no longer being updated to static pages. And so I think this is something a lot of us have encountered, these large, old digital collections that are really useful, but maybe are starting to break down, maybe are on older technology and it needs to be updated, and you're kind of asking yourself what to do with this. So this was at the Library Publishing Forum just last May. Chris Diaz from Northwestern University presented about this. And so this is a proof of concept. This one that I'm showing you right now is actually the old site of the Chicago one. And he presented a proof of concept site that he made here, which is the exact same site in static using Hugo as a generator. And so he manually converted all the HTML to Markdown. He used a student. It took about a week. And then he talked about using just a script to kind of scrape the database. So he wanted to just see if this would work. Again, we were talking about scale. This is scale, and it's actually incredibly large as a website, and it works lightning fast, and it's actually really quite interesting. It's not meant to be a content management system, so there's no interface for adding data, but it was long kind of finished as a project, so it worked really well for that use case. The next one I want to talk about is a participatory community-based research project that happened out of Philadelphia that's using the WAX framework. So this is the same one that we looked at earlier, but it's been stripped of all the kind of images in IIIF, and so it's a really basic kind of new Jekyll theme. This one, I'm not sure why they chose a minimal computing approach. They don't have any kind of information out there about why they chose this one, but I think it's an interesting example of kind of a singular interface that just shows a lot of images. And so it's got about a little under 5,000 proposals that are up there, and it's just a very, very simple site. And then it's got the interface to be able to see it with a map. So I'm going to speed through this so that we can look at the open pedagogy. So we were talking about teaching, and this is the first thing that I encountered when I saw the presentation, was this idea of teaching with minimal computing. So collection builder, I referenced this in libstatic, and so this is the other kind of example of framework next to WAX that's being developed right now. This is really new, and so if you go on the web pages, you'll see a lot more to come being developed right now. But it's the same kind of premises of being a static site generator. It uses Jekyll in a slightly different way than WAX. But he's focusing a lot in terms of how to do it as a learning tool in a digital library environment. The next one that we talked about was WAX. And it's grant funded right now, which I just encountered this a couple days before the presentation. If you click on the link, it's actually a scrolling announcement, and this thing is Star Wars. I just really wanted to throw that out there because I thought it was great. So it's new development, but it is grant funded development. In contrast, WAX framework is being developed out of Columbia University right now. It's open source, and again, they talk a lot about how this is a teaching tool around this idea that the skills are agnostic, right? So they're talking about the fundamentals of web development, data management, plain text editing, and Markdown as opposed to anything else. This is what I really want to show you, though, and this is the 2017 art history seminar class that was developed at Columbia that used WAX as a framework to be able to teach the class. And so this was Alex Gill partnered with a professor, and this was the first kind of proof of concept with WAX where they were looking at it. And so in the syllabus, they were basically meeting twice a week. One day they would talk about the seminar and the art history, and they went to the Morgan Museum, and then the next week they would really kind of dig into the technical and the Markdown. And so it's this idea of kind of going back and forth. They have some really good documentation, so you can see the syllabus, you can see all the class projects, you can see all the exercises, and kind of see how they used it in that way. So the last one I was going to talk about really briefly is this open research. And basically the idea here is when you have a digital collection or a digital exhibition that's based on the grant, why are we not doing this openly from the get-go? Often there's 2 or 3 year lag times before you actually publish a website. And so just starting to use these ideas and thinking about whether or not we could put it into GitHub right off the bat and actually use it as a tool for documentation, for collaborative editing. You know, you're digitizing this stuff, you need to give it to somebody. Why not just put it in GitHub so they can pull it down from there? And then the last thing is the papers and presentations. So this is just a slide with a bunch of links so you can see what other people are kind of talking about, the static sites and different kind of minimal computing efforts. And then come join us. So we're going to be looking at WAX tomorrow as part of a workshop. The workshop is meant to be just a group of people coming together and working through the tutorial. So it's going to be very relaxed, come by at any time, and it's probably going to extend out into Hackfest after. So if you're curious, come by. That's it.